So welcome everybody, I'm John Hay. I am the executive dean here at the Kennedy School, but more importantly, and certainly for these purposes, I'm co-director of the Center for Business and Government. The director is Larry Summers. Just a couple things before we get started about CBG. The main thing is, I guess, that I would say is we have a vast array of programs within CBG. I encourage you to go to the website and look at some of those programs. You can cut across economic policy, you can cut across energy policy, environmental policy, and particularly things around environmental economics and global climate change. Any of those are fair game on our website. We have over 50 faculty who are affiliates of the center. And in particular, we have student activities as well. We support the joint degree with the business school and the cohort of business and government students. But more importantly, what we are here for today, we have three individuals with us, and I'll let Larry introduce the director, Ken Rogoff from the economics department, Jeffrey Frankel from here, and Larry, who is, as I said, Deanie and Frank Weil, director of the Center for Business and Government here, Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School. With that, today's topic is achieving shared and sustainable growth. But I look at this as a very far-reaching kind of discussion, and we're going to open it up to all of you for comments and questions as we go forward. With that, I will turn it over to Larry.
Thank you all for coming. Can you all hear me? We're not taping this, are we, Dave? Do I need the microphone? Thank you all for coming. We've just had a chance, for better or for worse, to hear my views. So I'm not going to give any kind of speech here. What I've done is ask two of my favorite colleagues, Jeff Frankel and Ken Rogoff, to join us for a discussion around shared and inclusive prosperity. There was around 1976 through 1979 the most remarkable collection of graduate students in international economics in the history of the planet at MIT, largely taught and influenced by the late Louis Dornbush. Two of the members of that class were Ken Rogoff and Jeffrey Frankel. Two others were Paul Krugman and Maurice Obstfeld at the University of California at Berkeley. Anyone who thinks that things are random and that clusters are not part of life should ponder those four people, Jeff, Ken, Paul, and Maury, who have set so much of the agenda of the field of international economics now for the better part of 35 years. It's the most unlikely thing I could imagine, other than the time when three of the world's best 5 tennis players hailed from Sweden.
Did you come down and take the course too?
No, but I was not. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I was not. I was not in your great and glorious number. Ken Rogoff has been at a number of universities, has become a grandmaster in the game of chess, and has been the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. Jeff Frankel has been my colleague at the Kennedy School for some time. Was also my colleague in the Clinton administration, and he served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. There are a few topics in international finance that these gentlemen have not made important contributions to, and we are lucky to count them as affiliates of the Center for Business and Government. I asked them to say whatever they wanted to say for a few minutes about shared and inclusive prosperity. I may insert a thought or two, and then we'll throw this open to discuss anything that you all want to talk about. Ken?
Well, thank you very much for being here. This is a great event, not the IDEASpHERE. Let's hope that happens many more times in the future. You know, I think it's disappointing how paralyzed our government's been. There are so many positive things that the government can do, and so much of the conversation has all been about either, shrinking government or expanding government without maybe improving the quality of government. You've talked, Larry, about public infrastructure projects, and I don't think that's a minor thing. I think that's an area, especially if we define it quite broadly, where there's huge needs. They were there before the financial crisis, and they're even more compelling after the financial crisis. Education. This isn't just a matter of spending more money. This I view as an area where we need to think about things differently. There's all kinds of work going at Harvard about that. I know Jeff's written recently, saying on a short list of good policies would be preschool education. I certainly agree with that. But I would put on my short list also having more forms of adult education. I think we live in a world where people have to reinvent themselves many times over, and not everyone can do that. It's not easily equal. It's not easily accessible to everyone. But I think we should offer more opportunities, and I think the internet, for example, offers many possibilities for that. That sort of brings up one of the reasons it's hard for the government to seemingly get involved in our country, because suddenly it becomes very political. What if one of the courses is teaching evolution or something? It becomes very political, or there's a view that everyone's right-wing or left-wing. We felt this with NPR, public television, where they struggled for funding. I hope that doesn't block the government playing a role in providing greater public education on the internet, because it's hard to imagine we wouldn't have that be an important feature of our future. Obviously, that we'll come to talking about all the issues about inequality later. There's certainly some things in our system which, not necessarily the dominant factor, but are ridiculous. The fact that many people, especially if they can afford a lot of accountants and lawyers, can basically bypass the inheritance tax, the carried interest, that's still around is kind of incredible. So there's certainly some low-hanging fruit. On the other hand, I think there are challenges ahead which are really profound with technology and computers and globalization. I don't necessarily think bringing new challenges, but so fast that they come in, the people don't have time to adapt, and I think that really is the challenge of our age. So why don't I stop there?
Yeah.
So I guess
I think I'll interpret the phrase shared prosperity as meaning we aren't concerned solely with total GDP, the size of the pie, but the division of the pie. In other words, inequality, or apparently there's this French word for inequality pronounced piqueté. The tremendous amount of attention. I mean, I think all three of us have had, and everyone in our profession has been sort of called upon to say, what about piqueté, write something or say something about it, which I think is really, is mainly, I've got his book, I'm going to read it this summer, haven't read it yet. And most of the pundits say, as much as confess they haven't read it. But it's many people felt it was ripe, I guess, for to have a national conversation about it. I think other countries sort of talk about it all the time, but in the United States we don't really as much. And then in the IMF, they've been talking about it a lot. In terms of the specifics, if you interpret Piketty as not just a synonym for inequality, but his argument is that there is a historical long-term tendency towards more and more inequality because capital accumulates. The rate of interest is greater than income. And this comes at a time when others have been making an argument, in a way, an even more alarming argument about a unstable dynamic system that would go towards increasing inequality, namely that the rich capture the political process. And it's not exactly news that the people with more money get to have more influence. But then the claim is if you capture the political process and then you use it to change the policies to favor your group, then that's an unstable system, and we end up with even more inequality. So there's others arguing that, and I think there's all kinds of wrinkles in it. I mean, there's the argument that maybe inequality is not a trade-off with growth, but that if you reduce inequality, that's good for growth. I mean, the IMF has been saying a bit of that lately. There's arguments about that maybe the global financial crisis was caused by inequalities, some of which are more persuasive than others. There's an argument that the problem is that it's envy. I'd be perfectly happy with what I have, but if I find out someone else who's got more, that makes me envious. And one particular version of that I find actually attractive is an idea that part of what's driving things is not that executives care that much about the extra $1 million in their salary, but it's a proxy. They want more. Each one wants to earn more than the others. It's a kind of prestige race. Anyway, I would rather that we not debate about whether the rich are evil or class warfare or good or bad or left or right but just what are the sensible policies that can reduce inequality without doing much damage to growth, or in a few cases like universal preschool education probably helping growth. And I don't think we spent enough time talking about those. I don't think it's a complete explanation that people with more money are set on pushing policies that favor them, and then they buy it, and they buy some congressmen, and so they get it. I mean, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of money in politics, and there's a lot of single interest groups of politics that go outside of economic issues as well. But so I mean, my list of policies and other things that ones that would improve inequality without doing much damage to incentives would be to go a little back on the estate tax to where we were, relieve low-income workers of the payroll tax. That would move in the right direction. Expand the earned income tax credit. These are things, and by the way, pay for where it costs money, like preschool education. Pay for that with much more efficient taxes, like energy, carbon tax. These are ways of improving inequality without doing much damage to growth, or in some cases even helping growth. And I think that people understood the economics more. That's kind of the big obstacle. It's not just oligarchy or plutocracy. There's how do the rich get their influence? At least in the United States, not much corruption, not at the federal level. It's mainly because every senator and congressman and presidential candidate needs lots of money in order to run for re-election, to persuade people to vote for them. So persuading people is probably of what are the right policies and which politicians support the right policies, whatever it is they may say about what they think, what they actually do when it comes to voting. That seems to me more a bit of use for like our time when we write op-eds or whatever, than trying to get everybody excited and whipped up and emotional against inequality.
Give you a view on one part of this. It's, I think, not the conventional view. I'm as worried about inequality as anybody. My worry is mostly because inequality represents income that could be going to help middle class and poor people, and isn't. And what I want to see is a society where middle income people's incomes grow as rapidly as possible. I don't find most of the discussion of money in politics very thoughtful. If you ask me what's the single most pernicious role of money in politics, single most pernicious in the United States,
I think it's the NRA, which has successfully thwarted gun control despite the fact that the vast majority of people want it. It's got nothing to do with rich people. It's got to do with the ability to raise a large amount of money in $100 and $1,000 and $5,000 dollars from extremely intense minority. If you ask about dumb outcomes, you know, in American politics, American cities where the taxi cab drivers are blocking Uber. American cities where you can't build buildings tall so as to preserve the value of the buildings who already have. You ask about the major elements of protection in the American economy, sugar subsidies, various kinds of agricultural interests. None of that has anything to do with any kind of wealth that is new from the rising inequality since 1979. If you give, you know, it's a remarkable thing actually about politics. When I was president of the university, if you wanted to have a meeting with me, and the only reason there was going to be a meeting was that you were a potential contributor to the university, you had to be considering a 7-digit gift. Or you wouldn't get a meeting with the president. You wouldn't get a meeting with the president of the university if the only purpose was discussing your gift. If you ask about a presidential candidate 3 months before the Iowa primaries, the threshold is probably a 20th of that. 50, you were going to credibly mobilize $50,000. You could get a 30-minute meeting with a leading presidential candidate 3 months before the Iowa primaries. $50,000. I mean, at one level, that's a lot of money. But at another level, relative to discussing how the top 0.1% has more money than it used to, it's nothing. And so I think you can argue about money in politics, and you can argue about inequality. But the proposition that because of inequality, money is more distorting, because there's been an increase in inequality, money is more distorting of our politics than it used to be, I think is extremely implausible. I mean, the Koch brothers are like massive contributors. It's like unbelievable what they're doing. It's $100 million every 4 years. They've got $30 billion. Would it really make a difference if we were talking about 1% of their wealth every 4 years or 0.3% of their wealth every 4 years? I don't think so. So I would suggest as an observation that because people don't like money in politics and they don't like inequality, there's a tendency to conflate the whole thing. But I'm kind of skeptical as to whether that conflation makes a lot of sense.
If I can just add something on the general topic of the inequality. I've certainly been teaching and using Piketty as a Piketty, I don't know how you say its name.
So I think it's like cockatoo. It's first strongest accent on the first syllable.
Cockatoo and Sayaz. I've been teaching the work for a very long time and think it's very interesting. There's a number of issues, technical issues, but I buy the big picture. But the really big picture, I think, is over the last 3 decades have been the most spectacular for reducing poverty in the history of the world. If you look at what happened in India and look at what happened in China, and it's basically capitalism. So we're going to have a theory that capitalism doesn't work, doesn't help poor people, is not good for people. That's an overreach. That's a philosophical overreach because, in fact, a lot of the things that have been creating inequality among what are really the upper middle class of the world income distribution and the very rich of the world income distribution are mirror images of what's been happening with globalization. And I don't know that we can conclude in the larger picture what it will be like going forward 20 or is a very big change. But we're having policies that slow down growth, and no one's advocating that here. I think we have to ask, what's the effect on poverty? What's the effect on poverty in America? What's the effect on poverty around the world? So I sort of want to step back and take some perspective on that. I'd also say that if we lived in a closed economy and we could set the rules and not have to pay attention to the rest of the world, I think I wouldn't mind growing more slowly. I worry about the technology advancing so fast and people not being able to adjust to it, and the social changes, not just the economic changes. I know that sounds like, well, what about the people who like the horse and buggy and the auto? But I actually worry about a world where it's happening very fast. And I think the problem is that we don't live in a closed economy. We live in this competitive world. If I ask, about my children and my grandchildren, do I care if their friends or the equivalent of the middle income, are they twice as well off or 4 times as well off? I actually don't care at all. I think as long as they're better off and feeling gradually getting better off, that's great. I would care if you told me that China had grown by 40 in that period, and we, could no longer, counterbalance in the world. I mean, being hyperbolic. But that's a problem in thinking about these policies. And just sort of in conclusion, I, sometimes joke about Piketty's book that he's come up with a set of policies that, if adopted by the United States, would finally make France competitive.
The floor is open. Yes?
I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about tax structure. So I live in North Carolina. We've been through a lot of, should it be a flat tax? So we had a reform to cut the tax so everyone's facing a 5.8% personal income flat tax. The idea being that political folks think it's great to have everyone have a bigger piece of the pie in their pocket, versus earned income tax credit. We've gotten rid of that, and so the progressive tax system's gone. How do you think about sort of those sorts of trade-offs? And then there's that whole conversation about broadening the base, which we've done a little bit, to have a tax more of a service economy than a manufacturing or economy of the 30s. How do you think about those things when you think about tax structures?
I'll start. Since I was studying public finance when these guys were studying international economics in graduate school, I'd say a couple things. First, you need to distinguish between, to just be slightly technical for a moment, average tax rate progressivity and marginal tax rate progressivity. So if you say that you have to pay 5.8% in taxes on all your income above $40,000, then 5.8% is a constant, but the more income you earn, the higher the percentage of your income that you're going to pay in taxes. But from the point of view of fairness, it's probably more about average rate progressivity that's relevant than it is marginal rate progressivity. So I would say that taxes in aggregate, in my view, ought to be progressive in an average rate sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that every individual tax should be. Second comment, in general, I think that it's better to broaden the base than it is, and have lower rates, than it is to have a narrower base and broader rates. I don't think it makes as much difference as people often say it does. For example, suppose you say that state and local taxes are no longer deductible, and so we're going to reduce federal taxes. Well, then you could say we're broadening the base and lowering the taxes. But of course, from my point of view, my tax rate's higher. My state tax rate is higher because I can no longer deduct it for federal purposes. So in some sense, the real marginal tax rate hasn't changed. And a lot of what's called broadening the base has that same kind of character. If you say that I can no longer, if I give a quarter of my money to charity, and you say I can no longer give my money to charity at a deduction, then in some sense you're making charitable purchases more expensive than they used to be. And that's what I spend part of my money on, you're also reducing my incentive to work. So in general, I'm for broadening the base, but I think it's tend to be made in somewhat easier arguments than it actually is. I don't remember if it was Ken or Jeff who said that the extent to which the estate tax is avoidable is kind of outrageous, and is something that clearly ought to be fixed. I was astounded when I learned what a grat was, and what it made possible in terms of tax avoidance. And the only real defense for a grat is that even more sophisticated tax lawyers can explain to you why, even if grats were eliminated, there would be ways of achieving the same thing that a grat achieves. So it's not a simple problem to collect fully, but that is I think probably the single most important change that we could make. I also think, as I alluded to downstairs, that addressing the problem around unrealized capital gains, and especially unrealized capital gains in conjunction with stepped up basis of death, is a very serious problem. There was a substantial flurry of activity around Warren Buffett's comparison of his tax rate with that of his secretary. But the larger issue is that Warren Buffett has a net worth of $40 billion. He earns, I think we can safely assume, a good deal more than 5% on it. Let's say he earns 10% on it each year. That means he earns $4 billion. His taxes, when he was explaining how his taxes are on the order of $20 million, he's not paying 1% of his income properly measured in taxes, and much of what people discuss wouldn't go after that at all.
I would just add that it's hard. I mean, we economists think about the whole system integratively, and we can come up with a system that works much better if we can just change everything down to Social Security, so that these problems are mitigated. And I think the versions of a flat consumption tax are kind of attractive, but they're very theoretical compared to what we might actually see if we move in that direction.
Well, we now have a state doing it, so you can start looking at it.
Yeah, let's not get too far from the practical decisions. I mean, a flat, different people mean different things by it. In general, I think that broadening the base and lowering rates is a good thing. And Larry had some points about some, which I think are kind of second order about some places where it runs into trouble. But if you're talking about trying to strengthen the budget for the long term, federal budget for the long term, to deal with the deficits for entitlements over the next 30 years, one of the places to look at is tax reform, and to look at the tax expenditures, which have their supporters, but the ones that I would focus on are, this is all very unpopular, but the mortgage interest deduction kind of distorts things in a way we don't want, I think, in terms of you think about the sources of the subprime mortgage crisis, and the deduction for health, corporate deduction for health insurance. These are things that kind of move the incentives in the wrong direction and cost a lot of money. So if you could eliminate some of those deductions and some others, and lower the tax, that's a kind of flattening that I think economists generally are in favor of. In terms of the progressiveness, some of the highest marginal rates are effectively at lower income workers, where they try to pull themselves out of poverty, if you count the fact that they lose other benefits. I already mentioned payroll taxes, but if you count losing housing and Medicaid and food stamps and so on, they pay some of the highest marginal rates. I think most Americans are are in favor of a progressive income tax system. And I was looking at a paper by some political scientists about the surveying the rich, the upper 0.1% on their political attitudes. And to support Larry's point that it's not the only or necessarily primary, the number one distortion in the system is rich getting what they want. NRA is just one example. There are lots and lots of examples of that are orthogonal to it. Well, a couple of things struck me. The attitudes. The rich are substantially more liberal on social policy than the rest of the country. They're not getting their way on that. They're substantially less likely to support military intervention in other countries, in Iraq and so on. They're not getting their way on that. Substantially more, sort of pro-science. They're not getting their way on that. And by the way, even on the question of do you favor progressive income tax, 2/3 of the super rich, the 0.1%, do favor a progressive income tax and think that there's too much inequality. Where they answer very strongly against is policies that may sound like that they're going to pay a high price in terms of efficiency and incentives and growth. That's where they get along.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. My name is Brooke Suter, and I've spent 20 years working on environmental health issues on the state level and the national level in this country. And I came to Kennedy School because I was curious about how to better address climate change. I felt like I needed a more international perspective. And in talking to people, sort of started to look more at alternative GDP. And so my question is, it seems to me that the way GDP is currently defined, it's more about constantly increasing consumption, which seems unsustainable. And I'm very new at this, so I'm very simplistic. But I wonder if a conversation around alternative GDP, and I've been having some conversations with folks in Congress and also some people in China, looking at metrics that include things like inequality and sustainability, et cetera. Just as unemployment has 6 metrics, if GDP instead of 1 had 5 metrics that included to a degree inequality, sustainability, some of these issues that we're concerned about, I'm curious if you think whether that would help provide a framework for conversation with decision makers and with the public that would help get at some changes that would be positive.
Give you a view. My colleagues here may disagree. I have ambivalence about this in the following sense. I think it's easy. I agree with you in principle. It's better to have more metrics and indicators than to have fewer. It's appropriate to take account of depletion of various kinds. One wants to be aware of inequality. What I'm always struck by is the people who embark on this virtually always do it with a negative orientation. That is, virtually invariably, they are making a set of adjustments that have the effect of correcting the GDP growth rates downwards. From my point of view, look, we spend 17% of healthcare on GDP. So 17% of GDP on healthcare. That's a lot, but most fantastic thing that's happened during my lifetime is probably the fact that life expectancy for people like the people in this room is 12, 15 years longer than it was when we were born. That's a huge thing. People would pay huge amounts of money for that, and it's not reflected in the GDP at all. The fact that we no longer face a serious threat of a nuclear attack in the way we did up until 1989, that is a huge and positive, that is a huge and positive increment to well-being. So I think that the principle is right, but I think one has to be a little careful to make sure that the emphasis isn't all on these negative aspects. So, for example, the people who want to do this invariably want to take very close account of our depletion fuels, for example, you know, so sustainable, just like we depreciate a machine, we need to deplete the fuels, okay, I get it. There's logic to that. But the same logic, I'm afraid, implies that when we discovered fracking, we got an enormous gain. And the people who are interested in this subject tend not to be interested in recognizing those gains. So yes, I'm for multiple metrics, but I'm a little disillusioned by the project because in virtually all of its various incarnations, Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen have had incarnations, Ken Arrow has had incarnations of this project, a range of non-economist commentators have called for this in various ways. Virtually always, the emphasis is on a set of negative corrections to GDP growth, and I'm not sure that's basically the right orientation in thinking about the problem.
An exception is the Bill Nordhaus. That's a incarnation which is straight, I think.
There was something 40 years ago
Still doing it.
that, yeah, no, that would be more, yeah, but that's not the ones that tend to capture the imagination in this movement. I don't think.
I think the UN did a good job with the Millennium Development Goals of sort of, you know, saying, what are we trying to do here, and laying out a very broad range of issues. I mean, it's, you know, they run into trouble because countries haven't been able to meet them, but that's a completely separate question. So I could imagine trying to change the conversation more around a broader set of goals. I'm not sure it would be a mechanical thing. I mean, the environment is very, I basically view it, you know, as a risk of catastrophe being what I'm really worried about. Yeah, the global climate change being risk of catastrophe, and how do you think about that? I think it's very important. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure how to put it into a GDP number in a way. When it goes up, it's like we're all getting, burned from the face of the earth. How do you measure that when it goes from 2% to 3%?
There are attempts to measure green GDP. I mean, the climate change part's really tough, but the air pollution and the water pollution have gotten much better in industrialized countries over the last 30 years, and there are attempts to measure that. But I personally think trying to combine everything into one measure is tough, because although I think most people place value on market-measured GDP and on the environment and on inequality, but to try to say exactly what the different weights are and to sum it up in one number is not an enterprise that I actually find that useful.
Yes.
The name of the center is the Business and Government Center, and I'm reminded that in Venice, the mercantile class showed great concern for the opportunity of the lower class in Venice. And you've been sitting at the center of power and met with a lot of business leaders. Are they concerned about the issue of inequality and the opportunity for the middle class, or do they just sit on the sidelines and focus on their narrow industry-specific issues?
It's interesting. John Kennedy, when he famously said in his inaugural address, ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. If you think about it, it's been a long time since any politician said anything that sounded like that. It's Democratic Party's gone from that to the Middle Class Bill of Rights. And it isn't better on the other side of the aisle. So I think that there is a tendency for business to focus on its more parochial interests. Perhaps even there's a stronger tendency than there used to be, though that's difficult to gauge. One important part of it is the whole question of corporate citizenship. If you're a global company that earns 40% of your profits abroad, or 60% of your profits abroad, then the extent to which your interest is identified with the American interest is likely to be significantly reduced. I think there's a lot of interest by business in improving education. Some of that's because they want more and better trained workers, but not all of it. I think there is an awareness that if things become sufficiently bad, it will lead to various kinds of questioning of the market system that will be adverse to the interests of business. So I guess my sense would be the concern is there. It certainly could be there to a greater extent. Yeah.
Thanks, David Rosenberg. I'm building a couple manufacturing facilities, and when we look at where to build a facility, we look at some of the stimulus that help from a financial standpoint to build a plant in one facility or another. We look at stimulus for job creation, job training, and that's one part of it. And I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of, is the government doing enough to stimulate, those are like jobs for less educated and training for less educated. And the other part of that is we're encouraged, and I'm sure our company's not alone, to buy products from China. And we're getting stimulus from the entities like the China Development Bank to buy product from China. So they're providing our capital, our capital, as long as we buy product from China. So in that sense, is there more that the U.S. government can do to help inequality or help manufacturing here?
I mean, I guess the usual thinking is that certainly in terms of helping inequality, it's better to do it through the education system, the tax systems, and these interventions which cause distortions. We do have an export-import bank. It's gotten small compared to anything in China. There's the GATT has certain laws and restrictions on if you're doing something temporarily to hurt the WTO. That you're doing something temporarily to kill the other firms and you're going to gouge later. There are rules about that. Anyway, I mean the usual thinking is that you want to do it through the education system, through the tax system to the extent you can.
Well, in addition, one of the maybe the most important thing we could do is get the whole economy moving again. I mean, the reason why poverty rates have gone up and long-term unemployment has gone up is just is a macro economy. I personally think that the reversal of fiscal stimulus, the fact that we had 3 years of pretty strong fiscal contraction in 2011, 12, and 13 is a lot of why the recovery was so slow and where these problems come from. And I put high priority on that.
Yes.
So I'd like to start with something that you said in the previous session, about aggregate demand, which kind of capsulizes, in my understanding, a model that frames the discussion, which Jeff just mentioned now. And so I want to describe that model and then talk about an alternative model and then ask for the comments of any of you who feel inspired. If you're in the business of economics, you're in people's well-being. And Adam Smith tells us that the well-being comes from production, which comes from the efficiency in the use of resources. So then you come to this current model where we have consumption, which leads to aggregate demand, which leads to employment, which leads to income, which leads to general well-being. At least that's the model. It's a system for inspiring people through one measure or another to buy things they don't need, because the things that they need they bought already with the money they had. Okay, so agree or disagree? Okay, so the question is, there's another model, which is, suppose we look at the population and we say, we're going to look at what's the floor that everybody needs to have the minimum level of well-being. And then we will use that as the criterion for the spending. And to increase the productivity of people who are below the floor or at the floor, who are near the floor. This would be an alternative way to frame the discussion, which is never discussed this way. You're dancing around with it, but we're going to have education, we're going to add to their cognitive capital, we could add health and so forth, but essentially it's just dancing around the way Ken did. He's talking about education, people, a little bit they talk about. So what is the, why is this a useful alternative way to look at frame the discussion, and if it is, why isn't it being done? Is there any prospect of moving to alternatives? Because the current model is an inherently flawed model. It leads to great distortions in the economy. Inherently, it's a boom-bust system which results in great capital destruction.
Ken or Jeff, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, I think, I find unfortunate that the debate takes such a view of is there aggregate demand or isn't there aggregate demand, as opposed to the quality of government, what the government's doing. If we're spending on public infrastructure or spending on education, and the educations, they're both tricky. I mean, it looks good on paper. We've lived through the big dig here and, sort of want to see something efficient. But, if you're doing that, then I don't really see why there would be a debate. And whatever your view about the multipliers, which I think we have a lot of uncertainty about, I think there's definitely a case that when you're at the zero bound, they're larger. But I'd still say we have a lot of uncertainty about what they are. Well, it doesn't matter. It's interest rates low, a lot of unemployed construction workers, intertemporal substitution, and the most neoclassical model says you should be doing more infrastructure. We live in a world where people have to change jobs more. Well, you need more education for that. So I find sort of depressing how much the conversations about cut, spend, as opposed to doing something with quality. And I think it's particularly disappointing in the context of having this financial crisis where many countries do use that as an opportunity to rethink things and to try to do things a little better. I don't see it in this country. I don't blame anyone in particular. There's a paralysis in government. But to me, that has been the most disappointing thing out of the financial crisis, is that we haven't been able politically to pull things together, to take constructive approaches where it doesn't matter what your view is on there are enough things to do where it doesn't matter what you think the multiplier is, that I don't think we need to sit around and argue about it, although we probably would anyway.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you. My name is Kevin Leahy. I've been working on climate policy for about the past 12 years. But it's great to be here to hear a discussion of good policy. I don't think there's any shortage of good policy ideas or understanding of good policy. But you mentioned paralysis, and it's caused by the political environment, different from the conversation here in terms of the rich manipulating the system. It's a populist movement where I'm from. I've got Rand Paul across the river, and that crazy liberal John Boehner just up the road. So, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for how these policy ideas, if there's any way to translate these policy ideas in a way that resonates with the values of that particular faction, so that something might be able to work.
First of all, I think we need to keep some perspective on just how paralyzed America is with. It's inadequate in many respects, but if you look at the history of major financial crises in the world, the response that the United States mounted beginning in late 2008 was the fastest and largest in the history of the planet. While that was happening, the United States did move to pass the most consequential piece of social legislation in 2 generations, with universal health care. While that was happening, as a consequence of what was happening in the private sector and what was happening in the public sector, we are now on a trajectory to being a substantial energy exporter within 5 years, when the previous view had been that we were doomed to perpetual energy dependence. While that was happening, in a period that was, depending on just how you measure, maybe a tenth as long as the Civil Rights Revolution. We went from a totally different place on the role of gays in the military, gays' ability to marry, to adopt children, in what in historical time is a gnat's eye. That I blink, that changed. While that was happening, we had the largest overhaul. You can argue that it didn't go far enough and that there's still problems too big to fail, but we did have the largest overhaul of financial regulation in 60 years. All the things I just described have happened within the last 5. So to suggest that somehow during these last 5 we have been uniquely and dangerously gridlocked is, I think, rather an overstatement of the problem. And I think a little historical perspective is helpful, whether it was Lester Thoreau calling the society a zero-sum society that was dysfunctional and couldn't get anything done in 1979, before Ronald Reagan unleashed a, like it or not like it, but it was a substantial set of policy change. Very interesting to go back and read what the historians were saying in the early 1960s. A month before John Kennedy died, James McGregor Burns, the famous American historian, had come forward with an essay basically explaining that the great problem with America was that it didn't have disciplined, cohesive political parties. That the damn problem was that there were all these Republicans from New England and the East Coast who were to the left of all these Southern Democrats. And if we could just get things rearranged so that all the conservatives were in one party and all the progressives were in another party, then elections would really resolve things and the country could move forward without gridlock. And that wasn't just like one historian's theory. The American Political Science Association had convened a major commission a year or two before that congealed that wisdom. So I think we decided as a country at the beginning to have checks and balances, and to have a lot of checks and a lot of balances, and that might relate to why we've still got the same functioning system going, basically, that we had 260 years ago, and 250 years ago, and that virtually no place else has had a system that has lasted that long. I think the experience of post-World War II Britain, which privatized steel 3 times and nationalized it three times, is sobering on insufficient number of checks and balances in a democracy. So if you ask me, am I frustrated that my good ideas, or what I think are my good ideas, can't get pushed through faster? Am I frustrated that, Congress can't pass an immigration bill, Congress can't pass a bill on how to reform the housing, GSEs, we don't have a tax reform bill, we don't have a Social Security reform bill? Of course I'm frustrated. But if you kind of step back and take a slightly broader view of it, this notion that the country has been completely gridlocked and unable to do things for the last 5 years is not, I think, a tenable reading of its history.
So
Larry,
Congress
that was
doesn't
brilliant. For unconventional wisdom. But I mean, the last 3.5 years, virtually anything that the president, since the Congress changed, virtually anything that the president proposes, even if it was something that the other party had been in favor of 10 minutes ago, they're against. I mean, there is a degree of gridlock, which is unusual.
Well, I mean, look, I am as angry at the Republicans as anyone. Even there was tax legislation that was due to expire completely at the end of 2010, when the Republican Congress happened. You might like or not like the decision that resulted. high income tax brackets went up, the rest of the tax reform was made, you might like or not like that compromise, but it was a consequential decision. You might or might not like the fact that an agenda of defense cutting that would, I personally loathe it, but the fact that an agenda of defense cutting that would have appeared very optimistic to a liberal Democrat 3 years ago has gone into effect. You might like or not like the fact that a set of measures controlling domestic spending have gone into effect. I don't much like it. But I wouldn't confuse the fact that we don't like some of the things that have happened with a statement that nothing has happened. I also think that we make a mistake, and this is a mistake that people on our side, progressives, I think are particularly prone to making, which is we confuse all social progress with the passage of legislation. It is a big thing that healthcare costs grew less rapidly over the 4 years, 2010 to 2013, than over any 4-year period since the Second World War. Things in Obamacare are contributors to that achievement. It'd be a mistake to call it all or largely the result of Obamacare. Will the growth rate stay down forever? Probably not, but the path will be lower forever because of that. So I don't think, even so, if you look at healthcare, you look at energy, I don't think it's right to say that nothing has been happening that has been important and constructive in terms of the results of government action. Should there be more? Yes, according to me. By the way, should there be more if I'm getting my way? Yes. Should there be more if they're getting their way? No. Should there be more if we flip a coin to decide who gets their way, and it might go either way? I'm not altogether clear.
I mean, I second what Jeff said about this is all utterly brilliant, but the polarization in the political process is just stunning. And in a way, you exemplify that, Larry, because the right considers you a radical left-winger, and the left considers you a radical right-winger. And that probably wasn't true, in your first round in government. I mean, it's really noticeable how far the two sides have drifted. And it is, you have greater instability potentially in the policies that'll happen depending on which way government shifts. And when you have the split houses, the split government, there seems like a lot of low-hanging fruit which isn't being picked.
But you hit the key point, Jeff. Ken, you hit the key point, which is quite tricky. The polarization sort of has happened for whatever reason it has happened. If you said that runs the risk that we'll have lots more major policy vacillation. It probably does. If you reduce the gridlock, you'll get even more policy vacillation. You'll get even more stuff like the nationalization and privatization back and forth of British steel. So I think you have to be very, look, the history on this process stuff, history on process changes in American politics is they never work out the way people thought they were. Take, for example, the filibuster reform. Historic filibuster reform in the late 1960s, the number was going to come down from number for a filibuster was going to come down from 66 to 60. So the idea was then it would be much easier to break a filibuster and the country could really move forward more effectively. That was the idea. What happened? When it was 66, since it could really stop everything and it could never be broken, it was only an extraordinary thing that was done on matters of high principle. When it came down to 60 and it was normalized, it then became something that more or less you did on any time you disagreed in the Senate. And in effect, you changed the hurdle for passing Senate legislation upwards from 50 to 60. Exactly the opposite. The PAC, the idea of the PAC was that labor unions would have terrific PACs. And PACs were a big pro-Democrat reform. And people thought when PACs passed that it was going to really be a big Democrat thing, and Democrats liked it and Republicans didn't like it. What happened? Exactly the opposite. So I just think that a lot of caution is in order in thinking about these questions of process and process reforms. Yes?
Just two questions on the sustainable growth side of things and growing the pie. First one is obviously there's a lot of central bank intervention. I'm wondering if you're seeing any signs today where it's actually having a negative impact, and how you think about the progression of how that should be removed, assuming that's unsustainable. And then secondly, when you talked about medium-term challenges, one that you didn't mention was China in terms of its fragility today. Second largest economy, massive intervention, potentially large disequilibria. How do you think about having a beautiful deleveraging, whether that's possible or whether or not there's potential systemic risk and a challenge there in the next 12 to 24, 36 months?
I mean, I think those are two important issues, but putting them in context. So I think China is a big concern in the sense that the world's not ready for that if China has a big slowdown. I think my biggest concern would be there are all these people in the emerging world who are coming out of poverty, this huge period. Angus Deaton wrote another great book around the same time called The Great Escape, about how so many billions of people have come out of poverty, and there are people who are just out, people on the edge of coming out. China collapse would set things back, be very discouraging, and difficult to know how it would translate into political instability. There's lots of things to worry about there. So on the one hand, I think they're very smart to be trying to recalibrate their system and make it sustainable. On the other hand, I think we're all holding our breath, as to what happens. I think the central banking is incredibly important, but I don't think it's the driver of this. I think that it's much more so in Europe, where they're sometimes the only functioning European institution, and they're asked to carry just an enormous burden, and there it's much more complex. And here, they did amazing things in the financial crisis, but it has narrowed again. And so it's a really important issue, and we have seminars and papers on it all the time. But I'm not sure it's sort of the central thing in this topic of shared prosperity.
One more question. Yes, sir.
You talked earlier about sort of the poker game and sort of distributing the chips a little more broadly so that everybody can bet the bigger pot. What do you think is a practical solution, given the gridlock we've discussed, given like the way the political system is set up right now, but practically speaking, what is a practical path to doing that, getting that done without having the adverse effects of demotivating the wealthy from working too hard because they can tax too much, or demotivating people from getting too much transfer payment that they didn't really earn and get lazy.
I don't think I've got a lot to, I don't think, maybe my colleagues will, I don't think I have a lot to add to the suggestion that appropriate tax reform that broadened the base, closed a variety of loopholes, would operate in constructive directions. One of the disincentive effects of lack of taxation that tends not to be highlighted is the demotivating effect of the accumulation of substantial wealth on the productive contribution of potentially highly productive people. For example, and that's an aspect that tends not to be highlighted. I think there is room for very substantial initiative around something Jeff touched on, which is the reduction of the marginal rates at the low end. And that the challenge is to design programs that can't make universal. that you have to phase out. But the process of phasing them out involves high marginal tax rates. An aspect of this problem that I am embarrassed to say did not immediately occur to me, though it should have till somebody pointed it out, is when I was Treasury Secretary, I was very aggressive, and I guess I still think I was on the right side, but I now see it as more complicated than I did at the time, in furthering all kinds of efforts to collect child support. You know, my view is people's fathers should pay their child support, and it's terrible if they don't pay their child support. We've got everybody's tax records and all kinds of information, and the resources of the government should be used to support it. I think that's basically right. But it is true that if you have to pay 40% of your income in child support, which is not atypical for a father with 2 or 3 kids who he's not living with, then that, on top of taxes, on top of losing your benefits, can create a situation where the incentive to work is roughly non-existent. Not saying people don't have to pay their child support isn't such a great answer either. So it's a pretty complicated problem, but I would just remind people that as you think about the low end, and you think about the incentives at the low end, the workings of the child support system are an aspect in addition to the aspects around government payments. I'm getting signaled that our time is up. Thank you all very much for joining us.